Hello everyone, and welcome to this video that I've prepared for you on the topic of Utopia, the perfect place if indeed it does exist. Now, who hasn't dreamed of the perfect society? A society where there is no crime, no poverty, no hunger, no want, no greed, anything like that. You know, it's an idea that political thinkers, poets, painters, working people, everyone has thought of the perfect society. And we have a word for it, and the word is utopia. The word utopia, however, didn't come into the English language until 1516 with the book by Thomas More called Utopia. It has a longer name in Latin, and he uses two Greek words, ou, meaning no or not, and topos, meaning place. So literally utopia means not a place, right? Because it is a fictional world that he creates in his book, and it's a place that doesn't exist, that he hopes exists. It's often, though, confused. The word utopia is often confused with the Greek the Greek prefix eu, meaning good. Okay, if we think about words like eugenics or Eumenides or other words like that, and the eu means good, and topos, place, good place. Now this is a confusion. The word utopia means nowhere. It does not mean a good place, even though ironically it does mean a good place. This is an error, as I found out from Etym Online, an error that is reinforced by the opposite of utopia, and something that we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks' time. And the error is with dystopia, because dys in Greek means bad, and so dystopia is a bad place, as seen as the opposite of no place. However, the opposite of no place would be what? Every place? I don't know, not dystopia. And the word, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the word dystopia first came into the English language more than 300 years after the word utopia, and that it came around in 1844, 1844, and was used by John Stuart Mill in a speech in 1868, where he describes himself as a utopian and describes his enemy as dystopians or cacotopians. Okay, so there we go. That's a little bit of the origin of the word utopia. The origin of the concept, however, dates back to Plato's Republic, if not before. Okay, those of you who were in my class last term for the political animals, we went through Plato's Republic and how it was a nicely organized society with the philosopher king, the warriors and the workers, all a nice stratified society that worked to the harmony. For the harmony of the good. Everyone knew their place, everyone knew their role, and consequently you could create the perfect republic. So the concept of the perfect society has been around since, and it makes some sense, it has been around since the beginning of written history, but the word, as I said, was introduced in the 16th century. 100 years after More wrote his Utopia, you have three important works: Francis Bacon's New Atlantis in 1626, Gerard Winstanley's The Law of Freedom in 1652, and James Harrington's Ocean in 1656. These are works that appeared in the 17th century, and they were, again, writing in about new places, new foreign lands where their imagination could roam and they could talk about the freedoms that they wanted. Why? Probably because in the 17th century there was a strong monarchical presence, and if anyone dared to criticize the status quo directly, they would be punished. After that, in the 18th and 19th century, it's interesting to note that between 1700 and 1850, 40 versions of books called Utopia appeared. Right, so that's 40 versions, and also you also have the satire of Utopia, which is seen in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, which came out in 1726. And we couldn't talk about Utopia without talking about Voltaire's Candide ou l'Optimisme, which came out in 1759. It is his satire, his criticism of the concept of utopia is surmised in the expression, tout va bien dans le meilleur des mondes. This Candide's idealism is juxtaposed to the misery and the torment that's going on around him. And so Voltaire is saying that yes, you can think of utopia, you can think of all these great places and this philosophical, happiness, but at the end of the day, or indeed at the end of the book, it was il faut cultiver notre jardin. So that's Voltaire's damning criticism of utopian ideals. I imagine in the 18th century, people were maybe a bit fed up of hearing about the idea of utopia with nothing happening, and then of course the French Revolution happened, 1789, and this showed that maybe the idea of a new society was possible. And some people say that the French Revolution was the first utopian experiment. It was the overthrowing of a new society, and this kind of degré zéro of society would enable the construction of a new one. I think it's best seen in the idea of the new Republican calendar, which literally set the clock back to zero and said that the era of the French began here. Okay, it was a new time, a new calendar, and it was very idealistic. However, the revolution turned to terror, and there was paranoia, there was executions a go, and people became very, very kind of reticent, critical of the idea of utopian experiments. But in the backdrop of this, in the early 19th century, we have to remember the Industrial Revolution. And certainly in the UK, or in the UK and other parts of Europe, the Industrial Revolution created a huge gap between the rich and the poor. There were huge profits to the mill owners who weren't checked by the state. The state operated on a laissez-faire dynamic, which meant that construction of mills, people could make a lot of money, but at the same time there were horrible working conditions for the workers. This was happening at the beginning of the 19th century, where the state let the landowners and the mill owners do almost whatever they wanted, and the state was a very, very weak form at that time, and they could really, really oppress the people, right? And that is where, and this is after the French Revolution, and that is where the important writers such as Charles Fourier, who lived from 1772 to 1837, and Robert Owen, who lived from 1771, so born just a year before Charles Fourier, and died in 1858. This is where these two writers come into play. Charles Fourier is a very important writer on the subject and would inspire people, as we'll see just in a moment. And Robert Owen also had his own socialist or utopian experiment in Scotland. And these are two important thinkers who would start to influence the way that the political class thought. And that is where you have the rise in the beginning of the 19th century, the rise of the state, because the people were unhappy, and they were influenced by these writers. And then, of course, we have the year 1848 as a culmination of this utopian ideal. But we've already spoken about this. However, suffice it to say that it was in the middle of the 19th century that workers' rights did actually improve. That this utopian, these utopian ideals of harmony and no oppression and a better balance of rich and poor actually started to happen, and that was after 1848. A cool thing that I think that happened with the utopian experiments is that they happened. You have the mill owner Robert Owen, who was up in Scotland in a place called New Lanark. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he was someone who made a lot of money from owning a mill, but also he he created a society around his mill that really looked after the mill owners. The mill workers, and encouraged this. But there are also other experiments that you can think about. Which, for example, in between 1841 and 1859, 28 utopian colonies were founded in the US. Think about the US as this new land where there was plenty to discover, and the US was the perfect place for establishing new settlements. And the people who founded these colonies in the US were people who were the followers of Charles Fourier. And then also also another thing happened in 1893 when William Lane, who was an Australian, set out with 500 Australians to Paraguay and founded New Australia. Okay, so throughout the 19th century, you have these experiments, and these are just to name a few. These experiments of people, not just writing about utopia as was done, but in the 19th century, you actually see people experimenting with utopia, with utopian societies, and not only that, but you also start to see some of the socialist utopian principles being applied to state politics, being applied to national politics. I'm going to finish this short expose on Utopia with a few comments and something for you all to think about. And the first one is, what encouraged in the 19th century this revived interest in utopian politics? I mentioned just before about this juxtaposition between rich and poor, so that's one thing. But those of you who were in my class last term, and I'm sorry to bring it up again, but Machiavelli had introduced the idea of interpolitical writing of realist politics, okay, and this idea that human beings are horrible to each other, so let's accept that fact and learn to deal with it. But then there was this, as I said, there was this revived interest in utopian things, this idea of how things should be, or wouldn't it be great? Politics lived in the conditional tense. And so what in the 19th century brought that about? My second point that I'd like to make is the idea that whenever, so it seems in history, whenever the gap between rich and poor has been the widest, that is where you get more socialist, more utopian policies, or indeed writings. And I would like to make one comparison. It's quite a large comparison, but I'd like to make it all the same, and that is what was happening when Christianity was founded, is that created, and that is that you had the Roman Empire, and you had the Romans who were the chief, the big guys, and then you had the lowly Christians, and that gap between the Roman Empire and the early Christians was so big that the early Christians created, they in their writing, in their religious writings, that was the kingdom of heaven, because the kingdom of heaven was opposed to the empire of the Romans. You have that, so you have this huge juxtaposition between the two. And my final comment on this would be, and this is linked to this, is the idea of cooperation versus, i.e. competing against, or that's funny, cooperation versus competition. Do you want a competitive society, or do you want a cooperative society? People now in the 21st century are saying that competitive, and they have been for a while, but that competitive societies is what has led us to the problem with climate change, the consequences of this epidemic, growing unrest amongst the people, terrible living conditions, etc., etc., etc. People say that this is the responsibility of a competitive society, and that actually, if we'd learned to live in a more cooperative society, utopia would